Lillie is one of the best developed characters in the Pokémon anime. She also has a nice hat and a cute Vulpix. But more importantly, how exactly did she go from being absolutely terrified of physical interactions with Pokémon to being a real Pokémon hug monster, not to mention a badass? And how can we use her approach to recovery to overcome our own anxieties and blast off to a better life? Kindly request your Machoke to cross-chop that like button for the YouTube algorithm, and let's jump right in. Hey everyone, it's Charles. How are you today? Lillie is the star female protagonist of the Sun and Moon anime, an innocent, kind, and knowledgeable, if somewhat nervous girl from a wealthy but dysfunctional family. A father who disappeared after being sucked into an ultra wormhole, a mother who prioritized her research over the care of her own children, a brother with a handful of french fries strapped to his head. What a messy bunch. But in spite of this, Lillie turned out as a girl with both smarts and heart. When Ash arrived in Alola, Lillie was the second most recent student to join the class at Melemele Island's Pokemon school, and yet she had already amassed a ton of knowledge about Pokemon in the Alola region. And in contrast to her negligent mother, with whom her tumultuous relationship admittedly does improve later in the Sun and Moon series, Lillie shows a great deal of care for those around her and has a strong interest in Pokemon. However, there was always one serious problem holding her back from achieving her potential and from her desire to be with Pokemon. The fact that for a large portion of the anime, she was deeply afraid of physical contact with Pokemon, to the point where she froze up and turned whiter than vanilla ice whenever one approached her. Considering that Lillie is portrayed as a character very much in touch with Pokemon later in the series, and is more often than not seen with her Alolan Vulpix Snowy in her arms, what exactly were the origins of her phobia and how exactly did she overcome it? As it turns out, Lillie's inability to touch Pokemon stretches all the way back to a traumatic experience at Either Paradise in her childhood, when the type Null who would later become her brother's trusted Silvally pounced at her, and she saw her life flash before her eyes, or so she thought. Of course, there was more to the experience, but the rest of the distressing memory had been suppressed beyond Lillie's recall by the time we were introduced to her, because that's what happens in anime. Either way, the intense sense of fear she went through was enough to scar her with a powerful anxiety associated with making physical contact with any and all Pokemon. Not so different from a little kid who was nipped by a friend's dog at an early age who develops lifelong anxieties related to dogs, even dreading a friendly poodle running up to them at the park. And as is evident with Lillie and well documented in the field of psychology, childhood experiences can have strong, long-lasting effects on our characteristics and behaviors later in life, often in a way that is disabling and emotionally draining when it comes to the negative experiences. But the question then is, how can we steel chair those phobias and irrational fears right into the mat and get back to enjoying life? One of the reasons most people fail to overcome their anxieties is because they try to cope with them by evading the things that trigger their anxious feelings. It makes sense as a survival mechanism, but unfortunately this also renders your nervous system unable to beat your anxieties or unable to habituate to them, as all evasion ultimately does is keep the sources that trigger those feelings and the anxious feelings themselves unfamiliar and terrifyingly fresh. Even more unfortunately, evasion tends to let your anxieties progressively chip away at your circle of mental security, and before you know it, the fear you had of talking to one girl at school expands to a fear of talking to any girl at your school, to a fear of talking to any girl anywhere. And before you know it, you're a nervous wreck with women, and you find yourself trapped in a pit wherein you feel like there is no chance you will ever be with anyone, even though beneath the doubts, you know deep inside that there absolutely is. You just can't get started talking to people because you are afraid of the feelings or interpretation that you have attached to rejection. This is essentially what happened to Lillie, for whom the sense of fear triggered by her childhood interaction with Type Null encroached upon her comfort zone to the point where the possibility of physical interactions with not just Type Null, but any of the hundreds of other Pokemon out there would trigger an incapacitating panic alarm that shook her to her knees, into the dirt, into the dark, back into the middle of the pit, every time the possibility of feeling that sense of fear loomed a little bit too closely. She did love Pokemon from a distance and craved interaction with them, but she was a wreck. And how can one possibly climb out of a pit that seems so impossibly deep when you're in it? A core pillar of many anxiety therapy programs is to repetitively expose patients to the things that trigger their anxieties, until their negative interpretation of those things and the related anxieties melt away and they are left facing something that is not so scary on its own. Just as the cheap jump scares in a B-list horror movie stop being scary after the 20th or even the 10th jump scare, or how an abused, jittery cat will gradually relax and get used to its new owners petting it when it realizes that there isn't actually any serious threat. The sense of fear we connect to things that only scare us because of our misled interpretation of those things, it tends to subside through repetitive exposure. In Lily's case, there were two intertwined elements to her recovery, both of which she took the lead on and with which her friends continuously supported her. Firstly, habituation, the idea that repeat exposure to stimuli through which they cease to get a raise out of our nervous systems. And secondly, change catalysts, events, opportunities, or other things that come our way and can speed up the change process. Essentially, Lillie went through a process of habituation that kicked off when she embraced the first change catalyst that would initiate her journey towards recovery. And that catalyst was the opportunity to look after a Pokemon egg recovered from Mount Lanakila, which gave her a chance to get close and comfortable with her source of fear and begin this repetitive exposure or habituation process. At first, despite her advances in the right direction, Lillie was still unable to touch her Pokemon egg, and although Ash actually tried to move her along the habituation arc by having her pet his Pikachu, Rowlet, and Rotom, she just couldn't bring herself to do it. As with many scary, risky things, taking that first step is often the most difficult thing. And this is where the second change catalyst came into play in the form of a wild Salandit, of all things. Entering Lily's house while Ash and the others were occupied and seeing a tasty treat right there on the sofa, the Salandit lunged at the Pokemon egg, but Lillie did not hesitate to throw her arms around the egg to protect it. That is to say that her instinct to protect a living thing in her care overpowered her perception of that object as something fear-inducing and pushed her further along the road to recovery. And while I don't encourage you to throw a cat at someone who is afraid of cats, sometimes we do just need a little push to get going. These two change catalysts, the egg and the Salandit, were big movers for Lillie, and the habituation process only picked up speed when her egg later hatched into an Alolan Vulpix, who she named Snowy and with whom she gradually developed a close relationship, even as her discomfort with other Pokemon lingered on. She even went as far as to pull a classic Ash Ketchum when it got smashed by a sludge bomb. What a good girl. Of course, we don't all have Pokemon eggs or cute pet foxes to push us towards overcoming our fears, but is it possible that we could manufacture some of these positive change catalysts for ourselves? Personally, I used to feel extremely uncomfortable approaching people, so what I ultimately did was to simply envision the lingering, lifelong regret of a missed opportunity against the thing that triggered my sense of fear, the risk of approaching someone and, at the very worst, suffering a few moments of awkwardness. Something that seemed terrifying wasn't much of anything at all, and that is the case with a lot of sources of anxiety out there. To start with, just seeing something for what it was and shedding my interpretation of that thing really helped. Working from that viewpoint simply made future interactions so much easier, and better yet, I found that confronting my apparent fears to turn anxiety-inducing situations into victories didn't just habituate my nervous system to the experience of talking to random people, it also built confidence, showing me that I could master myself, and it initiated a snowball effect that made it easier and easier to rack up additional victories and additional confidence every time, until those anxieties were more or less snuffed out entirely. For Lillie, the confidence she gained from her ongoing successes with Snowy slowly bled into her interactions with other Pokemon, as she finally hunkered down to get comfortable with Ash's Pikachu, and was even able to ride a Stoutland, after reflecting on her big steps together with Pikachu and Snowy, and snagging a little bit of extra encouragement from Chad Dad Kukui and Olivia. As you would expect, every exposure numbed her fears while simultaneously winning her mental victories that reaffirmed her resolve to become able to touch all kinds of Pokemon. However, much of her progress would seemingly be unraveled in the 48th episode of Sun and Moon, when Nebby teleported her to a cave to speak with Gladion, and Type Null misinterpreted the situation as a dangerous one, lunging towards Lillie and Nebby and resurrecting the trauma of Lily's childhood in force. Following this experience, she reverted to being entirely unable to touch Pokemon, and yes, that even included Snowy. And this is a point at which many people would give up, as a failure to rise above the sense of fear and confront the apparent source of your anxieties is not only an unpleasant defeat in itself, but it can also destabilize all of the confidence that we've built up through earlier successes as well. These defeats can lead us to this uphill crossroads at which we can either push through the fire and flames and upwards towards recovery, or tumble down the path that leads us into relapse, right back into the pit. Fortunately for Lillie, this incident turned out to be another change catalyst in itself, as with some encouragement from Ash, it prompted her to set out on a journey to a series of locales from her past with the goal of confronting her repressed memories and recovering the knowledge of what had truly happened way back in the Type Null incident of her childhood. And at the conclusion of this quest, when Type Null evolved into Silvally to save Lillie from Creepy Faba, she finally unlocked her complete memory and discovered that way back then, Type Null Silvally hadn't tried to hurt her. In fact, it had lunged towards her in order to protect her from that Ultra Beast jerk who just caused so many problems for her family. In actuality, it had done nothing but try to save her, and it was only her interpretation of the event that had generated years and years of anxiety. As Lillie soaked in the revelations of her rediscovered memory, she apologized to Silvally for misunderstanding it all these years, and the two hugged, finally shattering a phobia that had haunted her for far too long. Lillie had embraced the change catalysts that came her way, undergone habituation, and topped it all off by tracking her sense of fear down to its roots and uprooting it like a dirty turnip. And from then on, it was all smooth sailing, except for the whole missing dad thing, but that is another story. I suppose the big takeaway here is that if you are suffering from anxiety or a sense of fear linked to something in a way that seems unreasonable, but you are still suffering from this experience, then it is quite likely that having the courage to step up and conquer these feelings through repeated exposure to the apparent triggers will ultimately lead you out of the darkness that you are in. That is not advice coming from a medical professional, so do take care to do what is appropriate for your situation, but for most of us, there is a pretty high chance that forcing yourself along the path of habituation will transform your life in a very positive way. But how about you? Is there something that makes you feel anxious, afraid, and will you keep living in the dark or master yourself like our friend Lillie? And how would you rate Snowy out of 10 on the cute anime creatures scale? I'm curious what you think, and until next time, as always, let's chat.